Back in the 1980s, I was working on the Mexican Revolution, which is my specialty, and I noticed that there were powerful American interests in Mexico that were being overlooked by the historians. And so I began adding up those interests, measuring them in various ways. Who were they, and what did they own? And I found that there were about 187 of them, maybe 83, that owned 130 million acres of Mexico. And on top of that, I noticed that their names were J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and on, with a who's who of American elites. And I thought to myself, how in the heck did the Mexicans survive that takeover of 130 million acres, all the railroads, all the mining, the timberlands, the best livestock areas, and the oil fields, including a who's who of the oil companies led by the Rockefellers? How in the heck could they do it? And then I looked at the actions taken between 1910 and 1920, and I found that between 5,000 and 10,000 Americans were kicked out of Mexico or fled and were living in refugee camps in San Diego, California, El Paso, Texas, where there were something like 5,000 of them, Bay City down here by Galveston, and New Orleans. And so there was this tremendous crisis, and the first thing that was obvious was that the Mexicans were able to recapture their country from that overwhelming power and penetration by virtue of the U.S. being preoccupied with World War I. But being a Mexican historian, I wanted to know what was going on in Mexico. And so today I'm going to take one side of that, and we'll just look at the American side of it as they moved into Mexico beginning in 1800 and take it up to 1900. But the end result is going to be what I just described to you. I haven't done this before, so I kind of feel like a guy that just jumped off an 80-story building in New York, and I'm about the 10th floor now, and I look over and I say, so far, so good. Okay, so be patient with me, and I'll try to get the information out to you in an understandable way. And the first influences in Mexico were indirect and, well, I should say obfuscated. They had to do with merchants coming down into the Caribbean from Connecticut and from Boston and selling machine goods, metal goods, dry goods to the people on the islands and in Yucatan. They were also in New Orleans, and so I'm supposing that they were probably in Tampico and Veracruz on the Gulf Coast. But the first real influence of the Americans in Mexico at that time came in the 1790s up to about 1810 in the form of ideas. And the big change, of course, was coming with the idea of independence. And the biggest reading concentration in Padre Miguel Hidalgo's library that I found is Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine, along with some European intellectuals, including Robespierre. And so this is a radical revolution in 1810 with heavy American influence, talking about liberty and setting up a bicameral Congress and an executive branch with the judiciary, very much along the American model. Not exactly, but very much. The influences that followed, however, were not quite so positive. And I want to introduce the first major players in Mexico from the United States who are already going south as families before these players arrived. One was a gentleman named Joseph Morgan. And he was in the Caribbean early in his career in the late 18th century and early 19th century, accrued a great deal of profit, and he created an insurance company in 1815 that he called Aetna. And then he created a bank, took over the Hartford Bank of Connecticut, and he built a bank that they called the Morgan Bank. It's now Chase Morgan or Morgan Chase. And then he acquired an arms company from Boston called the Peabody Rifle Company. And the Peabody Rifle at that time was on the cutting edge of technology because they were using the Bessemer patent to put grooves inside of gun barrels so that bullets would spin and not slice and hook. They would go straight, and instead of being good for 30 to 40 yards, they would be good for 500 yards. This is going to have an awful lot of importance for Mexico because these weapons will be used at San Jacinto. Alongside Joseph Morgan, who lived just south of Hartford, there's a road going down to New Haven, Connecticut, from Hartford, Connecticut, where another Morgan lived named Charles Morgan. And he owned a company called the Morgan Shipping Lines that worked out of Boston, Connecticut, New York, New Orleans, and had stops in Galveston and Matamoros, Mexico. In addition to that, he had a railroad that he was constructing from New Orleans toward Houston that became the SP later. And in addition to that, he had a steel company in New York, the towers of which, the chimneys, red and white chimneys, used to be across the East River from the UN building, and they were always there. Nobody in the media ever mentioned their historical importance, but this was Charles Morgan, steel magnate and provider of modern weaponry to Sam Houston at San Jacinto. And then another 15 miles down that path to New Haven from Hartford was a gentleman named Moses Austin. Moses Austin was upper middle class. He had tried to make a fortune in the lead industry and failed, but he was available to two of the richest men in the world, the Morgans, who controlled infrastructure coming out of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia to Latin America. Now we're talking about 1815. We're talking a long time ago. And Austin, presumably, I haven't seen the documents giving him a personal contract as an employee, but he represented the Morgan interests in Mexico City with Emperor Iturbide because they ended up with two contracts, one for 1 million acres on behalf of the Morgans in the Texas piney woods. This is Mexican territory. And the other, another another 1 million acre contract with the other competitor of the Morgans who was arriving at the same time, John Jacob Astor. And Astor did it the same way the Morgans did. That is, he created a bank, like the Morgan Bank, but this one was called Citibank. This is 1815. And the two of them come down to the south, where they align themselves with the biggest land developer in the Confederacy, what would become the Confederacy, Andrew Jackson. And Jackson, like all land developers, had a lot of ambition and not enough money. And so these two banking firms are going to be crucial to his success. And the Morgans put up the first insurance company near Savannah, and then they begin financing a railroad from there to Atlanta, which is not named Atlanta. It's named, well, it's named after the governor, the first territorial governor of Georgia, Altata, his wife's name, and so they call it Atlanta. And then on to Chattanooga. Pardon me, we're supposed to have a projector here, didn't work out. But you'd see a line running from South Carolina across Georgia and up to Tennessee. The objective in Tennessee are 60 million acres for development of Cherokee Choctaw, and Creek Indian land. Now there's an alliance of forces that are going to fight the Indians for a number of, well, for about 3 decades, from about 1805 to 1835, to gain those 60 million acres. One of them is a group of people, what we used to call rednecks in the US slang, out of Mobile, Alabama, who are under the command of an American general, Winfield Scott, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces in Mexico in 1847. And they're operating against the Indians from Mobile, seizing acreage in northern Alabama, which is turning into a mixed result. Some of them are going to land companies controlled by Jackson, and others are being settled, like the small settlers that would end up in Texas with 1,760 acre plots, mixed in with these larger developments. To their north, there were regular units of the US Army also fighting with the Cherokee and the Creek in the Choctaw that included 2 notable officers, Davy Crockett and Sam Houston. They were both killing Indians for a living, if you want to put it that way. And then the railroads are coming. One thing that railroads require are tremendous amounts of capital and control of the Bessemer patent, which was the thing that I mentioned with regard to their weaponry, but also for rails, locomotive engines, the hard steel you need for that technology was controlled by the city bank. They had a Bessemer patent holder on their board of directors. And so it's crucial for a historian to analyze the directorships of companies. Who are these guys? And when you find out who they are, then the company's strategies and decisions begin to make more sense. And so they reach Chattanooga, and then they go straight across Tennessee toward the Mississippi River. Now they've already, the Morgans and city, moved into the area around Pittsburgh to the north, and they're using the Ohio River as well. And so the 2 forces of projection, one across the south, aligned with Andy Jackson, and the one to the north, which is more, quote, Yankee money, is moving along the same trajectory, and they will intersect near St. Louis and go on to New Orleans. At that point, in the early 1830s, General Scott moves Army headquarters from Mobile to New Orleans. And so if you're looking at this on a projector map, you would see a red line crossing from Savannah across Tennessee and Georgia, and then into New Orleans and heading straight for Texas. Jackson was a member of a political movement with which the Morgans and Citibank, John Jacob Astor, agreed. And that was the creation of an enlarged confederacy. And this confederacy was called the New America Movement. New America included the states in Mexico of Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Coahuila, Chihuahua, Sonora, Sinaloa, and Baja California, Alta California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Texas. The other members of this movement would include Presidents Van Buren, who was very active, Pierce, who is an ancestor of Barbara Bush, Pierce family, and James Polk. So we have 4 presidents in rapid succession who are all members of the Young America movement, and they're also in favor of a vast expansion of slavery to the Pacific Ocean. That might explain why the Mexicans, it might contribute to an explanation of why the Mexicans are able to save the northern half of their country as it now exists, because the Yankees, of course, in Illinois and Massachusetts are not very happy with this movement. And so in the early 1830s, a movement is made to consolidate American control over Texas railroading requires assets. You build your railroad where the assets are. And so the board of directors of any railroad will say, okay, there's timber over here, let's build toward that place. This is a population center, we want to connect with it, and so on. And so they ensure that they have built-in profits as they build across the continent. The piney woods were the obvious asset here. And so each of them ends up with a million-acre property settlement well before Texas independence. This is in the 20s and early 30s. They also recognized the value of Galveston Bay as a commercial center and a population concentration there. Houston didn't exist yet. That would have tremendous real estate potential. Remember, Jackson's a real estate man. And so they're looking for population, urban potentials all along these lines as they move from Savannah to the west. With the defeat of the Indians and the deportation of the Cherokee to Oklahoma, the so-called Trail of Tears, that happened in 1835, the stage is set. The consolidations have taken place to the east. The stage is set for the so-called Texas Revolution, in which there is one person born in Texas at the Alamo. Everybody else is from somewhere else, including Crockett and the other guys. At the Battle of San Jacinto, the Mexican forces are divided into two major parts. 2/3 of them stay in southern Texas at Laredo to guard the valley, because there had been a number of attacks out of New Orleans against Matamoros and Tampico. And the other third are brought up to San Antonio, to the Alamo, and then onward over to Harrisburg and Galveston Bay. In the meantime, the Red Rovers, a group of people from Mobile who have been fighting Creek Indians called Red Sticks, and so they adopted the name Red Rovers, those people I called Rednecks. They come over to New Orleans, and adopting different names like New Orleans Grays, etc., they proceed to attack Tampico and Matamoros in the 20s. They're defeated both times, and the president of Mexico, Santa Anna, issues a command for their summary execution for piracy. If these people are captured, you just kill them. These are people attacking Tampico, raping women, etc., etc. They're commanded by James Fannin in both of those attacks, and now they are going to land at Matagorda Bay and march over to Goliad in 1835. As they do, we should be reminded that they have the biggest money in North America behind them. John Jacob Astor at that point in time was the richest individual in the world, and he's backing the Citibank, which is financing the construction of a railroad from Galveston to Harrisburg that they're calling the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad. And they've already, while the Mexicans are supposedly in charge, already in 1834-35, they're surveying the route and laying out supplies for the construction of the road. They have full expectation, I guess, that they're going to be taking Texas from Mexico. The characters arrive, they have their battle at the Alamo, and then back to San Jacinto. Charles Morgan, watching this, is gathering arms on the Ohio River in foundries that totaled over 7,000, making weapons, rifles. They were called Kentucky rifles that are really Peabody rifles with the ridges in the barrel that allow for the 500-yard range. And then those rifles are taken on at least one Morgan ship to Galveston Bay, along with 200 riflemen, presumably Kentucky would play a major role in that, since they're mentioned in the folkloric renditions. When the battle takes place, the Battle of San Jacinto, it turns out Santa Anna was up all night preparing fortifications for obsolete weaponry. He's expecting the other team to have muskets and obsolete cannons with smooth bores and round balls. I don't know what the cannonballs at San Jacinto looked like. They probably were still round, but they were modified to what armaments experts call high impact, and that is, with the riflery, modernized artillery has a much more heavier explosive force. And so they would just blow the fortifications that the Mexicans had spent all night building, just blow them away. But more importantly, Houston, upon arriving at the battlefront, prepares a plan in which they conduct a Schlafen maneuver, which is made famous by the Germans in World War I, in which you move a tremendous body of men to the left, forming an arc and flanking your opponent with tremendous firepower, and then you just simply wipe them out from the side. And the Mexicans are out there defending the flank with weapons good for 30 to 40 yards, opposing Texans, or whatever you want to call them, immigrants, like illegal immigrants, numbering about 400 or 500 of them, half at least with modern rifles. And so they wipe the Mexicans out, and then they have a kind of forced agreement in which the president of Mexico concedes Texas, quote unquote. Texas, however, is not defined very clearly, and so a lot of them think that it has to do with the Nueces River as the southern border, which was a common belief in Mexico, and the others see it as the Rio Bravo or Rio Grande. And that leads to a prolonged dispute up to 1847. And finally, in 1847, despite the efforts of Abraham Lincoln and John Quincy Adams to block the war, Polk, one of the new young American men, is able to successfully declare war, but he can't get funding. And this is crucial as an element of American foreign policy and how it's made even today. And so with Abraham Lincoln holding up approval in the House because he called it an immoral war. Lincoln, by the way, the more you read him, the more he impresses me. Anson Phelps, a member of the Citibank Board of Directors and the controlling element in a company called the Phelps Metals Company. It's now called Phelps Dodge, that just received the metals contract for Afghanistan, in case you're wondering about American foreign policy, obtains Polk's ear, gives him the financing for 3 months of the war. Despite the House of Representatives of the U.S. Congress refusing to fund it, it receives private funding for the war. And later, Phelps will receive the copper concessions for Arizona and Sonora. The war is fought with the ambition of cutting Mexico from Mazatlan to Tampico northward. However, a guerrilla war breaks out that forces the Americans to abandon that military effort because they don't have the budgetary support for a prolonged guerrilla war. And it also is a major factor in the development of Mexican nationalism. Boy, do they come together fanatically. One of the cities in Mexico that's a famous soccer center now, called Santos, is named after the general who led the guerrilla effort to save Mexico from the American invasion. We don't hear much about that in the U.S., but in Mexican history, you do hear a lot about it. Some of the things that were done in Mexico were especially horrible. The rape and pillage of Mexico City, which we never talk about. American history needs to do some very self-critical we have to look at ourselves. But But the behavior was less than fortunate. We redeem ourselves in 1867. The war with the Confederacy has ended, and the General Lew Wallace is sent by, originally by Lincoln, but eventually allowed by Johnson, to Brownsville, where he delivers machine guns and weaponry to the Liberal Army of Mexico, which has no modern weapons, and they then destroy the French army in a series of battles. The same kind of delivery was made at El Paso. So you have El Paso, Juarez, named after the person who was there. Juarez received the weapons there. He marches south, and they defeat the French outside the city of Chihuahua, and then they defeat the French outside the city of Monterrey, and then they march on central Mexico, and the French retreat, announce victory, and leave. And so the Americans are kind of redeemed, and a group of Mexican generals want to import American capital and goodwill. And so they meet in New York in 1876, December of 1875, in the lobby. A reporter saw them, these Mexican generals coming into the lobby of the Citibank building in New York. And they meet there. And again in 1883 at Delmonico's in New York for a wonderful banquet. They've got the menu in the archives of the United States, in which the Mexicans agree to allow the Americans to take over transportation communications infrastructure, telegraph, the new telephone idea, and the railroads, as well as port managements. Now that's crucial, but as the railroads come, they come with interest in timber, minerals, oil, urban development for profitability. And so we go during the period 1876 to 1910 into a concentration of American wealth and power that is up until then unprecedented, except in Indian country, where the same thing happened in the US West. And so the American leadership knows how to do it, and by 1910, the Mexican masses, who are still overwhelmingly rural, there are 15 million people in the country, 12 million of them are rural, and they only have like less than, about a half of 1% own most of the land. The Mexican masses have lost 50% of the arable land to this government of generals that has empowered the American entrepreneurs and their own oligarchy. It's not just the Americans. They have an oligarchy consisting of about 7,000 individual families, plus the American 180 some. When you put them together, they had 98% of the country's land, and it was a farming nation. And so they rise up, and the people who rise up have deeper reasons. It's not just land, boy, that would drive me crazy, but they also have an idea about their ancestors. And so towns like Cuenca, Durango invent people that will defend them. And so they take the name of St. Francis, the protector of the village in Catholic history. And the name for Francis is Francisco. And they take that name in its common slang form, Pancho, and they add to it Villa, defender of the village. And they rise up, 120,000 of them, behind this fellow Villa, and you end up with 10,000 American refugees and a transformation of the country that would last all the way into the middle of the 20th century. Thank you.